She wasn't born in the dark, she learned to live there after the light betrayed her. There is a quiet kind of pain that doesn't scream, doesn't shatter things, and doesn't ask for attention. It simply rewrites who you are from the inside out. For Maleficent, that pain begins with something deeply human, something almost everyone has tasted at least once in their life: trust. It starts with the moment it collapses. Betrayal is never just about being hurt, it is about the realization that the world you believed in was never real to begin with. It is the slow, suffocating feeling that safety was an illusion, that love had conditions you didn't see, and that the one place you thought you belonged was never truly yours. In that moment, something fragile inside her begins to fracture. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like glass cracking beneath pressure no one else can hear. This is where the real transformation starts. Not in anger. Not in revenge. But in confusion. A part of her still wants to believe. She still wants to hold on to the version of the world where love meant protection, where connection meant safety. But another part, a colder, sharper part, begins to ask a different question: what if love is just another way to lose? What if trusting someone is the first step toward breaking yourself? So, the mind does what it has to do to survive. It begins to adapt. It begins to protect, not by healing, but by hardening. Emotions become quieter. Walls become higher. The heart, once open, starts learning how to close without making a sound. Feeling less means hurting less, and hurting less starts to feel like control. Control feels safe. But this safety comes at a cost. The more she protects herself, the further she drifts from who she used to be. The warmth fades. The softness disappears. In its place, something unfamiliar begins to take root, something that doesn't trust, doesn't reach out, doesn't hope. This is the moment most people misunderstand. They see the darkness and assume it was always there, but they don't see the process. They don't see the nights spent questioning, the silent negotiations between holding on and letting go, the slow surrender of innocence. Becoming dark isn't a choice made in a single moment, it is a series of small decisions. Each one built on the last. Each one whispering the same message: never let this happen again. Over time, that message becomes identity. It becomes armor. It becomes the only way she knows how to exist in a world that once taught her that love can turn into loss without warning. Maybe that's the most uncomfortable truth hidden in her story: darkness isn't always born from hate. Sometimes, it's born from love that had nowhere safe to go. And if you've ever trusted someone who let you fall, if you've ever felt that quiet shift inside you after realizing things would never be the same again, then maybe, in some small, unsettling way, you already understand her. There is a moment after the initial pain fades when something far more dangerous begins to take its place. It's not anger, not sadness, but clarity, a quiet and calculated understanding that vulnerability is no longer an option. What truly changed her was not just the betrayal itself, but what it taught her about power. Before that moment, she lived in a world where connection was strength, where opening your heart was not a risk but a natural state of being. But after it, she begins to see the world through a different lens, one where power belongs to those who feel less, who hesitate less, who depend on no one. This is where the internal conflict deepens. A part of her still remembers what it felt like to trust, to believe, to exist without constantly guarding herself. That memory does not disappear. It lingers like an echo, soft but persistent, creating a tension between who she was and who she is becoming. This tension is exhausting because it forces her to confront an impossible choice: remain open and risk being broken again, or close herself off and slowly lose the very part of her that made her feel alive. So, she chooses what most people choose when faced with that kind of pain: control. Control promises something that love never could: predictability, safety, distance from the chaos of emotions that once left her exposed. And this is how the defense mechanism fully forms. Not as a conscious decision, but as a gradual shift, a reprogramming of the self. Every future interaction is filtered through the question: what can this take from me, instead of what can this give? Over time, this way of thinking reshapes her entire identity. When you stop expecting kindness, you also stop offering it freely. When you stop believing in connection, you stop seeking it altogether. The world becomes smaller, colder, more manageable, but also emptier. And this is the paradox she lives in. The more protected she becomes, the more isolated she feels. Yet, the idea of returning to who she was feels even more terrifying because it would mean becoming vulnerable again. Vulnerability now feels like a weakness she cannot afford. So, she leans further into this new version of herself, reinforcing the walls, strengthening the distance, convincing herself that this is who she has always been. It's easier to rewrite your identity than to admit that you were once soft in a world that punished softness. And maybe that is the most heartbreaking part of her transformation, not that she changed, but that she had to convince herself that the change was necessary. Because deep down, beneath all the control, beneath all the distance, there is still a quiet question she cannot fully silence: was becoming this version of herself the only way to survive? Or was it the moment she truly lost something she will never get back? What makes her transformation even more complex is not the loss itself, but the war that continues long after it, a quiet, relentless tension between two versions of her identity that cannot coexist. Deep inside, the part of her that once believed in connection has not fully disappeared, it has only been buried beneath layers of protection. This creates a fracture within her. One side still longs for warmth, for belonging, for a world where she does not have to guard every part of herself. The other side rejects that longing entirely, seeing it as a liability, the very reason she was broken in the first place. This is where her unmet need becomes painfully clear. At her core, she is still searching for something she refuses to admit she wants: a sense of safe connection, a place where she can exist without fear of losing herself again. But the contradiction is that she no longer believes such a place exists. Every time that need begins to surface, it is immediately suppressed, pushed down by the belief that needing anyone is dangerous, that dependence leads to loss, and that love, no matter how genuine it feels, carries the risk of unraveling everything she has rebuilt. This suppression does not remove the need, it only distorts it. It turns it into control, into distance, into a constant need to stay one step ahead emotionally. This is what makes her internal conflict so exhausting. She is not simply rejecting others, she is rejecting a part of herself, the part that still hopes, still feels, still remembers what it was like before everything changed. Over time, this internal rejection creates a deeper kind of loneliness, one that does not come from being alone, but from being disconnected from your own emotional truth. She can no longer fully access the version of herself that once felt freely, and yet she cannot completely erase it either. So, she exists in between, never fully cold, never fully open, always holding herself in a state of controlled distance. This is where the real cost of her transformation reveals itself. While she has learned how to protect herself from pain, she has also unknowingly cut herself off from the very thing she was trying to protect: the ability to feel safe in connection. The tragedy is that this unmet need does not disappear. It lingers beneath everything she does, influencing her choices, shaping her reactions, creating a constant undercurrent of tension that she cannot fully resolve. To fulfill that need would require her to risk becoming vulnerable again, and vulnerability now feels like stepping back into the exact moment that broke her. So, she remains where she is, suspended between desire and fear, between who she was and who she has become. The question that continues to echo within her, even if she never speaks it out loud, is not whether she can trust the world again, but whether she can ever trust herself to survive it if she does. There is always a moment that does not look dramatic from the outside, a moment that could easily be overlooked. Yet, it becomes the exact point where everything inside a person shifts permanently. For her, that moment is not just the betrayal itself, but the realization that follows it, the quiet, irreversible understanding that what she felt, what she believed, what she trusted, was never shared in the same way. The real trigger is not the action, it is the meaning the mind assigns to it. In that instant, something devastating clicks into place. A new narrative begins to form, one that reframes her entire past, turning memories that once felt warm into something uncertain, almost deceptive. If trust could be broken so completely, then maybe it was never real to begin with. This is where the psychological shift accelerates. The mind cannot tolerate that level of contradiction for long. It has to resolve it, to protect itself from the chaos of uncertainty. So, it chooses a conclusion that feels stable, even if it is painful. Love is unreliable, vulnerability is unsafe, closeness comes with a hidden cost. Once this belief takes hold, it begins to overwrite everything else, every future interaction, every emotional response, every instinct. What makes the trigger so powerful is that it is not just about what happened. It is about how it rewrites her internal rules for survival. From that point forward, she is no longer reacting to the present. She is reacting to the meaning of that moment, replaying it, reinforcing it, using it as evidence that her new worldview is correct. This creates a loop. The more she believes that connection leads to pain, the more she distances herself. The more she distances herself, the more she confirms that she is alone. And this loneliness then feeds back into the original wound, making it feel even more real, even more permanent. Over time, this single moment becomes the foundation of her identity, not as a memory, but as a lens through which she interprets everything. What is most tragic is that this shift feels justified to her. It feels logical, even necessary. From her perspective, she is not becoming someone else. She is simply adapting to the truth she has uncovered. And that is why the trigger is so irreversible. It does not feel like a mistake. It feels like clarity, like awakening, like finally seeing the world as it truly is. Once someone believes that their pain has revealed a deeper truth, it becomes almost impossible to convince them otherwise. Letting go of that belief would mean questioning the very foundation they rebuilt themselves upon, and that is a risk she is no longer willing to take. So, she holds on to that moment, not just as something that happened, but as something that defines her, something that explains her, something that justifies every wall she builds from that point on. In doing so, she does not just remember the moment. She becomes it. At first, the change is almost invisible, not because it is small, but because it happens in silence, beneath the surface where no one else is looking. What begins as a fracture slowly becomes a reorganization of everything she once believed about herself. When a person can no longer reconcile who they thought they were with what they have experienced, something has to give. For her, it is not the world that changes, but her perception of it. Her emotional landscape begins to shift. Warmth feels unfamiliar. Trust feels naive. The parts of her that once moved effortlessly toward connection now hesitate, then retreat, and eventually disappear from her conscious identity. This is where the breakdown truly unfolds, not as an explosion, but as a quiet erosion. It's a gradual stripping away of softness until what remains feels unrecognizable even to her. She is no longer reacting as the person she used to be, she is operating through a new internal system, one built entirely around avoiding the pain she once endured. This system is efficient. It works. It prevents her from feeling that same depth of vulnerability again. But it also comes with a cost she does not fully acknowledge. In protecting herself from loss, she has also distanced herself from the very emotions that made her feel alive. Over time, this distance becomes her identity. She does not see herself as someone who has changed. She sees herself as someone who has awakened, someone who now understands the rules of a world that once deceived her. This belief gives her a sense of control, a sense of certainty that replaces the chaos she once felt. But beneath that control, there is an absence, a quiet emptiness that she does not allow herself to fully confront. To acknowledge this emptiness would mean admitting that something essential has been lost. Something that cannot be rebuilt through control or distance. And so, instead of facing that absence, she adapts to it. She reshapes her sense of self around it, turning what was once a wound into a defining feature of who she is. This is how the transformation completes itself, not through a single decision, but through repetition. It is through reinforcing the belief that this version of her is stronger, safer, more prepared. And in many ways, it is. But it is also lonelier, more isolated, and more detached from the part of her that once believed in something beyond survival. This is the quiet tragedy of her breakdown. From the outside, it looks like she has gained power, like she has become untouchable. But internally, what she has really done is trade vulnerability for control, connection for certainty. And in doing so, she has created a version of herself that can no longer be hurt in the same way, but also can no longer feel in the same way either. Somewhere deep beneath that carefully constructed identity, there remains a faint, almost imperceptible echo of who she used to be. Not loud enough to guide her, not strong enough to change her, but just present enough to remind us that this transformation was never about becoming something new. It was about losing something that once made her whole. What lingers long after the transformation is complete is not the pain itself, but the pattern it creates. Once the mind learns that trust leads to loss, it does not simply forget that lesson. It builds an entire system around avoiding it, and over time, this system becomes automatic. It shapes not just how she reacts to others, but how she interprets every situation before it even unfolds. This is where the long-term consequence reveals itself, not as a single outcome, but as a way of existing. It is a constant state of guarded awareness where nothing is taken at face value, where every gesture is questioned, every intention analyzed, and every connection held at a careful distance. While this may look like strength from the outside, it slowly erodes something much deeper. Living this way requires her to remain in a state of emotional restraint, never fully present, never fully open, always anticipating the moment things might fall apart. This anticipation becomes exhausting because it means she is not only carrying the memory of what happened, but also the expectation that it could happen again at any time. This expectation shapes her reality. It limits her ability to experience trust, to feel safe, to allow herself to believe in something without immediately searching for its flaw. Over time, this creates a subtle but powerful isolation. Not because she is alone, but because she is unable to fully connect, unable to let her guard down enough to experience the kind of closeness she once had. This isolation is not loud or dramatic, it is quiet, almost invisible. But it is persistent, following her into every interaction, every decision, every moment where she might have chosen to reach out but instead chose to hold back. The longer this continues, the more it reinforces itself. Each time she avoids vulnerability, she confirms the belief that it is safer this way. Each time she chooses control over connection, she strengthens the identity she has built around that choice. This is how the consequence becomes self-sustaining. It is no longer tied to the original event. It is now embedded in who she is, in how she sees the world, in how she defines safety and risk. What makes this especially tragic is that the very mechanism that protects her is also what prevents her from healing. Healing would require her to challenge the belief that vulnerability is dangerous, and that is a belief she has relied on for so long that letting it go feels like stepping into uncertainty without protection. So, she remains where she is, not because she cannot change, but because change would require her to question the one thing that has kept her stable. In that sense, the past does not just stay in the past, it continues to live within her, shaping her future, limiting her possibilities, and quietly ensuring that the version of her that once believed in something more remains just out of reach, not gone, but no longer accessible in the way it once was. There comes a stage where the pain is no longer sharp enough to notice, yet never distant enough to disappear. This is where her existence settles into something far more unsettling than suffering, a quiet, endless emptiness that does not demand attention but slowly consumes everything it touches. When you have spent so long protecting yourself from feeling too much, you eventually reach a point where you struggle to feel anything at all. For her, this is not relief, it is a different kind of loss, one that is harder to name, harder to confront. It does not come with tears or visible cracks, it comes with silence, with stillness, with a growing sense that something inside her is missing, but she cannot quite reach it anymore. This is the paradox of her isolation. She is no longer surrounded by chaos, no longer overwhelmed by the intensity of emotions that once defined her. Yet, in that absence, she begins to realize that peace without connection feels eerily similar to emptiness. This emptiness does not just exist around her, it begins to define her internal world. Shaping how she experiences time, how she perceives others, how she understands herself. Without trust, without vulnerability, every interaction becomes surface level, controlled, distant. Over time, this creates a gap between her and the world that cannot be easily bridged, not because others are absent, but because she is no longer fully present. This is where the loneliness deepens into something more existential. It is no longer about being alone, it is about feeling unseen even when someone is there. It's about speaking without truly being heard, about existing in spaces where connection should be possible but somehow never fully happens. Perhaps the most painful part is that she becomes aware of this distance. She senses it in quiet moments, in the pauses between conversations, in the subtle realization that no one truly knows her anymore. But instead of reaching out, she withdraws further, because the idea of being misunderstood feels safer than the risk of being known and losing it again. So, she adapts to this emptiness. She learns how to function within it, how to move through life without expecting too much, without needing too much. She convinces herself that this is enough, that this is stability, that this is strength. But deep beneath that acceptance, there remains a faint, persistent echo of something else, a memory of what it once felt like to be connected, to be open, to exist without this constant distance. That memory does not disappear. It lingers quietly, creating a subtle tension between what she has become and what she once was. Maybe that is what makes her solitude so profound, not that she is completely alone, but that she carries within her the awareness that she did not always feel this way. There was once a version of her who could reach out without hesitation, who could trust without fear. And now, that version feels like someone she can remember, but no longer return to. In that realization, the emptiness becomes more than just a state. It becomes a quiet question that follows her everywhere, asking not why the world feels distant, but when she stopped feeling like she belonged in it at all. And yet, even within all that distance, all that carefully constructed control, there remains something that refuses to completely disappear, a quiet, almost imperceptible part of her that still remembers what it felt like to be open, to believe, to exist without. Constantly preparing for loss. This is where her story stops being just about transformation and begins to feel like a reflection. The question is no longer whether she became someone else, but whether that original version of her is truly gone or simply buried beneath layers she no longer knows how to remove. This is the space where her existence becomes most fragile, not because she is weak, but because she is suspended between two truths that cannot easily coexist. One tells her she must remain guarded to survive, and another quietly reminds her that survival without connection is not the same as living. Over time, this tension becomes less visible but more defining, shaping the way she moves through the world, the way she interprets silence, the way she responds to moments that once would have meant something different. Now, every possibility of closeness is filtered through the same question: is it worth the risk? Most of the time, the answer remains no, not because she does not feel the desire, but because she no longer trusts the outcome. This is what makes her story resonate in such an unsettling way, not about extremes, but the quiet decisions we make after we have been hurt, the small shifts in how we see others, how we see ourselves, how we redefine what is safe and what is not. The truth is, many people never notice the exact moment they begin to change. They only realize it much later, when something that once felt natural now feels distant. When openness feels unfamiliar. When connection feels like something that belongs to a different version of themselves. In that realization, there is always a choice, though it may not feel like one. A choice between continuing to protect the version of yourself that learned how to survive, or risking the possibility of rediscovering the version of yourself that once knew how to feel. Neither choice is easy. One asks you to remain safe but alone, while the other asks you to become vulnerable again without any guarantee that things will be different this time. And maybe that is the real weight of her story, not the transformation itself, but the question it leaves behind: when the world has already shown you how easily trust can break, how much of yourself are you still willing to give? And at what point does protecting your heart stop being survival and start becoming the very thing that keeps you from ever feeling whole again?